Like many of you, when I was in high school, every day we would open up our Tanachs and we would study from our Holy Scripture. We'd study from Navi, we'd study from Ketuvim, we'd open up the books and we'd study words on the page. The words had meaning, the words had significance. But the only thing we were looking at was words on a page. Sometimes we even felt that the words were like projected there. We didn't know where they came from. They were just sitting there. We associated with the words, and we didn't think about who wrote them, when the words were written, and when they came from. What I want to speak to you about this evening is the question about whether we need to look a little bit more deeply, to try to peel back the curtain behind the words, and to try to consider and think a little bit more whenever we study our Holy Scriptures, our Tanakh, to try to think about who wrote the words, to imagine the circumstances in which the author, the writer, sat there with a pen, sat at his desk, and actually composed the works of Tanakh that we study. To think about these works not as words on a page, but as the product of an author who sit and put these words for us to read. Now, I didn't come up with this new perspective about how to look at Tanakh all by myself. This argument about whether we study literature as words on a page or whether we're supposed to think about the author is an argument that in every major university and every major academy in this country, if not in the world, academics of all stripes are arguing about. Right? The deconstructionists in the university setting say, forget about the author. Just look at the words. We don't care about the author. I guess all my rebbeim in high school must have thought that they were deconstructionists too. But there's another view, which is just as prevalent in the academy today, the view of the historicist, which says there's a whole other added layer of depth if you think about the author. Words get a deeper resonance if you realize the circumstances in which they were written. And what I think it's important for us to do whenever we study Tanakh is to think about when the words were written and why the words were written in the way that they were composed. Perhaps I'll give you two examples about to illustrate this principle, the importance of thinking about the author as well. My first example is about income inequality. You heard about it a lot in the news these days. It's like the big buzzword of 2014. So we in Judaism, we have an author who writes about income inequality. I think to yourself, which prophet is known as the prophet of income inequality, who writes about it more than anything else? Right, the prophet Amos is the one who talks all about income inequality. We get to hear from him a few times a year. Every year, Parshas Vayeshev, we get to hear about Amos. And Amos complains vividly about how life was in his time. How the wealthy sat there on beds made of ivory, in palaces. They had summer palaces, winter palaces. They would drink wine out of bowls accompanied by violinists and musical instruments. The wealthy were living in all the luxuries of wealth in the time of Amos. Contrast that with the poor, he said, the poor who could barely make ends meet, who couldn't finish the month, who weren't able to buy shoes. Amos complains vividly about the inequality in his day. Now, we've just studied the words on the page of Amos, summarized a little bit, but now I want to add a dimension by looking at who Amos was, the biography of the author. Any of you know anything about Amos? You know what Amos did for a living? One of you said it. Amos was a sycamore checker. He wasn't the guy who picked the sycamores. That was like a higher level up. He didn't qualify to pick them. He was the guy who checked the sycamores. He used to hang out with the cattle. Asher Yabanokdim b'tekoa. What class was Amos a member of? The lower class. He was a farmhand who worked worked with the cattle of the wealthy. Who Amos talks about his experiences when a sheep would be eaten and he'd have to save an ear to bring it back to the owner to say, "I didn't kill your sheep." Amos was a member of that lower class. Realize what happens to the content. We add such a dimension by understanding the author and where the author came from. And everyone likes to say today is that we need to connect more to Judaism. We need to connect more to what Judaism has to offer. And maybe the easiest way for us to get a greater connection is to try to connect more with the authors. Let me give you another example. I know everyone in this room has been saying a lot of Tehillim over the course of the last few weeks. Now I ask you, every time you said Tehillim, you called out to God. You said, God, save us. Many times. Did you ever think about the original author who first wrote those words? Because the story is amazing, right? We know who wrote most of the Tehillim? David HaMelech, King David. And when was he writing those words? The king was trying to kill him. He had fled away from the king. He was hiding in the hills of Judah. There were armies attacking him in one direction. And other nations were also hostile to him. The Plishtim, the Zippim. David is sitting there with a small band of men wandering the desert every day, wondering if it would be his last day. And it was in that context that King David would write, Koli el Hashem ezah, Koli el Hashem et chanan. God, I turn to you. It adds such a dimension, a depth, a connection. When we look at our Holy Scriptures not as words, but instead as a context, as an author, as an experience, as a situation which led those words to have been written in the first place. Now, I want to be honest with you. There is a risk. And I don't know the answer to this risk, but I want to raise it for something for all of you to think about. The more we make the words of Scripture into the words of the prophet, reflecting a prophet and his or her situation, right? They become the words of the prophet, but what do they cease to be? Less and less, they are the words of God. It's a challenge, and it's something that I struggle with. And if we make too much about the particular author and his situation, will we start to think about some individual writing this in his context and fail to see God's hand behind these words? So I don't have an answer to you, but I think it's something to think about. I think it's so important for us to add the depth and the connection that it's worthwhile anyway for us to think about the author. Let me give you another reason why it's important to think more about who wrote the books of Tanakh and the context in which they wrote it. Sometimes, when you think about the author, the purpose and the main idea of a book changes. Let me give you an example. Think for a second about Megillat Ruth. We read it less than a month ago. Think about Megillat Ruth. What's Megillat Ruth about? A lot of things to choose from. Could be about charity. Could be about conversion. So before we think about the author, Megillat Ruth is about conversion. It's about kindness. When we realize that the author of Megillat Ruth was the prophet Shmuel, it ends with the lineage of King David. And we realize that Midrashim have pointed to us to the fact for years that the reason why Shmuel wrote this book is to give us the lineage of King David. It totally changes the point of the book. Right? The purpose of Megillat Ruth is not to talk about giving charity to the poor. The purpose of Megillat Ruth is not to talk about Boaz's chesed to his family. What's the purpose of the book now? King David has just been anointed by Shmuel. You have a new king which is trying to unify the Jewish people, which will set the stage for the building of the Beit HaMikdash in the next generation. And what were people saying about King David? They didn't want to accept him. They wanted to see his birth certificate before they would accept him as the king of Israel. And so Shmuel writes Megillat Ruth with that purpose in mind. Right? When you realize who the author was and when they were writing, sometimes the purpose of the book changes. Let me give you another example. Think for a second about the book Malachi. We all know a lot about Malachi because twice a year, every year, we have Haftorah from Malachi. But do you ever think to yourself who Malachi was and what was the context in which he's writing? Right? We're rabbis, so many of us know the way Malachi ends. Malachi ends with the words, Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi, remember the Torah, and one more thing, Hinei Anochi Sholech Lachem et Eliyahu Navi, wait for Eliyahu Navi to come. Right? Malachi ends with one message. Wait for Eliyahu, and until he comes, just study the Torah. So did you ever ask yourself, what was the context in which Malachi wrote those words? Did you ever ask yourself who Malachi was? When you think about the author, Gemara Megillah tells us Malachi was written by Ezra, and you realize that Ezra is the last of the prophets. The whole point of Malachi turns. Ezra is sitting at his desk writing these words, and he knows this is the last word of prophecy that the Jewish people will hear forever. This is the last prophecy, and that's it. This is my last message before prophecy disappears forever. Alexander the Great and Greek science is coming. The whole world is going to change. The magic and the mystery of the past era is gone. We're turning to rationalism, and we can't have prophecy in such a world. This is the last message that God will communicate to man before the coming of the Messiah. So Malachi writes, wait for Eliyahu. He's the next prophet who's coming. And until he comes, Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi, remember to keep the Torah. We have to use the book. We don't have prophets anymore. We add a level of depth and we add a level of connection whenever we study a book of Tanakh and we consider who the author was and what was their circumstances. Hopefully I've made a case to you, and thankfully there are enough books of Tanakh that now you can go home and go through all the rest of one we didn't talk about and try to think more about the author. But when you read Kinot and Tisha B'Av, which is coming up, imagine Yirmiyahu writing them as an eyewitness to the Churban. And next time you read Megillat Esther, don't think about Mordechai and Esther writing the Megillah for posterity. Think about the feud that the Gemara Megillah tells us, that some people discounted the miracle of the holiday. And Mordechai writes the Megillah to convince people that this is a miracle they had to celebrate. Right? When you read Zechariah, you hear him say, Lo v'chayil v'lo b'koach, it's not with might. Remember that he's trying to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash, facing all sorts of forces going against him. When you read Melachim and you read Yirmiyahu writing about the exile of the 10 tribes, feel the tear in his eye that he knows within a generation, guess what's going to happen? He's going to follow the 10 tribes into exile next. When you read the books of Tanakh, don't let them be words projected on a paper. Think about the author behind it. Open the curtain. Think about the author, his circumstances, and why he wrote it, and build greater connection and greater depth.